Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling something that I think for many people is really personal. It's this often unspoken wound that so many of us carry into our adult lives. I'm talking about the quiet, persistent damage left by parents. And this is especially true in, highly hierarchical cultures like many in East Asia who, even when they were clearly obviously wrong, just couldn't apologize.
It's such an invisible injury, isn't it? It's like an absence. It's this empty space where validation and repair should have been, and that absence, that silence, ends up dictating so much of our adult behavior.
Our relationships, our work lives, everything.
Everything. So today we're diving into a really fascinating stack of material that examines this very specific generational phenomenon, the psychology and the deep cultural roots behind what we're calling the silent apology.
Okay, so let's unpack this right away, because the sources, they immediately introduce this really powerful and frankly heartbreaking paradox.
Yeah.
It's not that these parents were malicious. It's not that they were unaware they'd made a mistake. The material we looked at states very, very clearly that it's not that they didn't want to apologize.
Right.
The crucial insight here, the thing you have to grasp to understand any of this, is that they were structured both psychologically and systemically so that they literally cannot apologize. They're unable to say the words without risking a complete emotional collapse.
And that distinction is just vital. It's everything, really. Because if you see it as a choice, as them just being stubborn, that's where bitterness grows.
Of course.
But if you can see it as a deep-seated inability, one that's rooted in their own trauma and their cultural programming, then you start to gain understanding. And that understanding, that's the key to your own freedom.
Right. So our mission today isn't to cast blame on our parents' generation. It's to really dissect the systemic, the psychological, and the historical roots of this inability to say, I'm sorry.
Because only by understanding why that silence existed can we, as the current generation, find a way to heal that wound for ourselves, break the cycle, and make sure we don't accidentally pass that toxic pattern on.
So let's start with that foundation then, the culture.
Yeah.
When we look at the traditional family structure, especially in contexts like Vietnam or broader East Asia, what does the source material tell us about how an apology even fits into that social architecture? Or I guess how it doesn't fit.
Well, that's just it. It doesn't.
Yeah.
The sources show us a society built on this extreme structural rigidity. And it's all centered around a concept called tôn ti.
Tôn ti. Okay, what does that mean exactly?
It literally translates to respecting position and age. Imagine the family unit not as, a supportive circle, but as a rigid pyramid, a Kim Tom Thop.
Pyramid.
Exactly. The adults are at the apex at the top. The children are below them. And the younger you are, the lower your authority. Critically, the older adults, especially the parents, they're seen as almost untouchable, inviolable.
So the foundational law of this pyramid is that the superior is always right. Tren Loan Dung. It's not just a suggestion, it's a structural necessity for the pyramid to stand.
It is the operating system. And within this framework, if a superior parent makes a mistake, they are, and this is the key word, not permitted to admit it. And we need to spend some time here because this isn't just about personal arrogance or pride.
Right, it's a mechanism.
It's a mechanism they believe is absolutely necessary to maintain the entire structure, to hold it all together against what they perceive as chaos.
The material actually outlines these almost strategic reasons why not admitting fault is so critical for the parent. It calls them the 7 pillars of power that this silence is designed to protect.
Yes, and they reveal the deep fear that's driving the whole system. The number one focus always is on stability, both external and internal.
So what's the first pillar?
The first, and this is extremely important in collectivist culture, is Brienne, their public image, Juhan.
Keeping up appearances.
To an extreme degree. An apology, especially if other people see it, is viewed as devastatingly damaging to that public face. It risks social judgment, a loss of standing in the community.
And we have to remember, for their generation, losing face wasn't just about embarrassment. If you lost face, you could lose opportunities, you could lose resources, social safety nets.
Absolutely. An apology was a luxury they felt they just couldn't afford. The second pillar is purely pragmatic, maintaining control, or yukin.
The logic being, if I admit I'm wrong, my child will see me as fallible.
And then their control is diminished. And they equate that control with the child's safety and survival. In the unstable historical environments they grew up in war, poverty control was often the only tool a parent felt they had to ensure their family would make it. So for them, control literally felt like an expression of love.
That's a huge one. Then there's the third point, which is about preserving surface stability and order. The trait two.
Yes, this is about keeping the peace, but in a very immediate and maybe shallow way. Admitting you're wrong means you're inviting a debate, you're inviting an emotional discussion, you're inviting instability into the home.
Whereas silence, stiffness, denial.
It's fast, it shuts things down. Emotional processing is slow and messy. They chose speed and order over truth and connection.
And the fourth pillar. This one is interesting. It's about upholding the very definition of being a parent. Zihan yingal anchame.
Right. The societal definition they inherited required them to be these infallible gods, not flawed human beings. So if a parent admits fault, they feel like they are abdicating the role. They're no longer a parent in the way they were taught to be one. The minute they admit an error, they feel they've vacated the position entirely.
It's so absolute. And the last couple of points feel the most psychological. They do this to manage the deep-seated fears they inherited from their own parents.
They're just repeating the pattern. It's a pattern built on scarcity and command, not dialogue. They cling to that power structure because it's the only defense they know against a harsh world.
Which brings us to this profound idea that for them, an apology is seen as a dangerous, almost catastrophic act. If they believe that rigid hierarchy is the only thing keeping the family from falling apart.
Then admitting fault is like pulling a foundational block out of the pyramid. They genuinely believe the whole thing could collapse.
Okay, I have to stop you here because this is so central to the pain that we carry. How does the source material explain that huge leap? The leap from a simple, hey, I'm sorry I yelled, to the catastrophic fear that the child will suddenly, as the source put it, climb on their heads, Leo and Doe. It just feels like such a massive overreaction.
It is a massive overreaction, but it's rooted in their experience of power as being absolute. In their world, there was no middle ground. You were either the absolute authority or you were subjected to the will of others.
There's no negotiation.
None. The generation that raised our parents, they were often subjected to colonial rule, to constant poverty, to war. They didn't experience gentle transitions of power. They learned that power, once you lose it, leads to immediate subjugation. So they equate admitting fault with a total loss of power. For them, an apology is the first step towards chaos.
And here is the really powerful, crucial counter-insight that the sources give us. They think that apologizing loses power, but the painful truth is that not apologizing is what truly drains the real, genuine respect from a child.
That's it. The child doesn't respect the facade. They just learn to fear the parent's rigidity. The child offers obedience, sure, but that obedience is purchased with fear, not earned through respect.
And this leads to what the sources call a tragic cultural priority shift.
Yes. In this system, your individual truth has to yield to family order. Fairness and justice have to yield to surface harmony, the ha'aki. And your personal feelings, they have to yield completely to the hierarchy, the tanti.
That concept of justice yielding to harmony is huge. Can you give us a concrete example of how that plays out? I feel like we've all lived this.
Oh, absolutely. Think of the classic scenario. A sibling breaks a vase and unjustly blames you for it. You know you're innocent. That's the justice part. You try to argue your case, explain what happened.
And what happens?
The parents, seeing the conflict rising, immediately shut the whole thing down. They might punish both of you equally or just side with the older child, saying something like, "Stop arguing, we need to keep the peace." The ho'aki.
So your individual truth, your feeling of injustice is just sacrificed instantly.
Instantly, for the sake of restoring quick structural order. And the message you get is crystal clear. The system of order is more important than your emotional reality. Your feelings are irrelevant to the functioning of the family machine.
Which leads right into the systemic failure, the emotional skills gap. We're talking about a multi-generational lack of emotional education. It wasn't that they were just bad people.
No, not at all. It's that the entire system they grew up in lacked the ability to teach them basic emotional accountability. No one ever gave them the foundational emotional memo that says, apologizing isn't degrading. It actually builds genuine credibility.
That is the highest act of an adult because it teaches responsibility.
Exactly. But since their entire upbringing operated on the rule that apologies only flow one way from the bottom up to the top, they simply couldn't conceive of it flowing from the top down. They just repeated the only model they had ever known.
The model of silence, of power suppression, and this idea of absolute infallibility.
And that model gets passed down unbroken until someone has the tools to see it for what it is.
That cultural framework, It really sets the stage. But now let's move inside the parent's mind. This is where the source material introduces the central psychological concept, the parent's ego. And it's not just, arrogant pride. The sources describe it as something else.
They do. They describe it as a fragile, old, but necessary suit of armor that was built from a lifetime of prolonged emotional scarcity.
The sources call it the kaitoi kwenluk, which is like the power ego.
The power ego, yes. And we have to understand how it was constructed. This ego isn't a fortress built on solid confidence. It's described as brittle jinn, a thin, easily shattered suit of armor built on fear and the absolute necessity of survival.
You have to contextualize their generation.
You have to. Many of our parents grew up post-war in environments of deep poverty, scarcity, theothon. They lived with strict, often punitive discipline, and this intense social competition where any sign of weakness was just not tolerated.
So in that kind of environment, that pressure cooker of survival, where you might have been looked down on for being poor or uneducated or not having status, the only tool you developed for defense was to harden yourself emotionally.
That was the only strategy available. You learn that if you feel pain, you mask it. If you make a mistake, you deny it. You push through.
The cultural logic was just brutal. Who apologizes?
The subordinate apologizes. The weak person. The person who can be exploited and who stays silent. The one who maintains their position, their dignity, their ability to command resources for their family.
So for the parent, admitting fault wasn't just about admitting a mistake over, say, a broken dish. It was admitting their entire position in the world was shaky. It was exposing the very vulnerabilities they'd spent a lifetime trying to cover up.
And this leads us to the critical core defense mechanism. They are fundamentally controlling their own internal fear, not the child. The biggest fear isn't that the child will be disobedient.
What is it then?
It's the profound, terrifying fear of being seen as weak, of being looked down upon, which is exactly how they often felt in their own childhoods when they were powerless and at the mercy of others.
So when an adult child today points out a parent's mistake,
It triggers that deep, visceral memory of being small, powerless, and subjected to some unreasonable punishment or judgment by their own parents or by society. And the ego's defense mechanisms, denial, lashing out, a silent treatment, they activate instantly.
so the parent isn't actually engaging with their adult child in that moment.
No. They're fighting the ghost of being crushed, beat up when they were young. They are desperate not to return to that state of utter vulnerability, and they'll do anything to push it away.
So the lashing out is really a panic attack disguised as anger. They're trying to protect that small, crushed inner part of themselves.
That's a perfect way to put it. And their emotional toolkit is just so limited because it was built on a system of pure discipline, not emotional understanding. The only tools they know for managing conflict are the tools of power.
Yelling the silent treatment, punishment.
And the ultimate, unassailable decree. Because I said so, vitao noivai. The sources are very clear that they were never taught any of the soft skills. How to actively listen, how to offer a gentle explanation, how to simply validate a child's legitimate feelings.
And philosophically, I guess apologizing becomes illogical if you don't fundamentally see your child as an equal human being. If the child is just an extension of you, a subordinate, then why on earth would a superior explain themselves to them?
It was a non sequitur in their generation, it just didn't compute. On top of that, you have this immense societal pressure on them to be the perfect, all-knowing role model, the one who knows everything.
Right.
Admitting fault threatens that entire fragile identity. It exposes their own lack of, say, modern education or emotional depth, especially if they're first-generation immigrants trying to navigate a whole new culture they don't fully understand.
So they hold on to that rigid ego rather than just admitting, I don't know how to handle this, or I made a mistake, because that admission feels like it would cost them their status as a parent.
It's all connected. When your self-esteem, your long trunk is already damaged from being judged by society for being poor or not having opportunities, the ego inflates to compensate for that internal feeling of worthlessness.
And this creates that brittle ego you mentioned. It's highly sensitive.
So sensitive that they cannot differentiate between the act of apologizing and the feeling of being utterly demeaned or half up. To them, those two things are identical. Admitting fault is seen as a direct touch on the fault lines they've spent a lifetime trying to plaster over. It's the moment they fear their whole carefully constructed life will just shatter.
And as the sources note, That ego only gets heavier and more rigid with age because of the cultural emphasis on respecting elders' keen trend.
Right. The older they get, the more society expects them to be right, and so the harder it becomes internally for them to admit they're wrong. It just solidifies the cultural inertia that they can't escape. The silence only deepens over time.
Okay, so let's pivot now to the listener, to the adult child who grew up in the shadow of this silent apology. We've talked a lot about the parents' why, but what about the wound itself? When we were kids and we were wronged, unjustly scolded, totally misunderstood, and that apology never came, what was the unconscious message we internalized?
The message was incredibly powerful and often devastating. And it was communicated not through words, but through that absence. The message was, my feelings don't matter compared to my parents' position.
And maybe even, I must not be worthy of an apology.
Exactly. The source material explains that a child's brain is literally wired for attachment. It doesn't have the capacity to conclude, oh, mom and dad are flawed people with their own trauma.
No, of course not.
The child's brain concludes, I must be the problem, because the brain has to maintain that attachment to the parent for its own survival. So self-blame becomes this very early, tragic survival mechanism.
And this internal logic then just flows directly into our adulthood.
Yeah.
It manifests in these striking, sometimes contradictory behaviors that can dominate our professional and romantic lives.
The sources identify two major extremes that can result from this wound. They represent different ways the nervous system learns to cope with conflict. First, you have the hyper-apologizer.
I think a lot of people are going to recognize this one.
Oh yes, this is the adult who perceives any conflict, even a minor disagreement, as a profound danger. They grew up constantly saying, I'm sorry, even when they weren't at fault, because it was the fastest way to restore that surface peace and ensure they weren't abandoned or punished.
They're essentially trauma-recovering peacekeepers. They've internalized the belief that my feelings aren't as important as other people's feelings, so they use apologies as a kind of defensive shield to preemptively manage the other person's potential anger.
Right, it's not about taking responsibility for a mistake, it's about de-escalation. And their relationships often feature a lot of emotional burnout because they take on the emotional weight of everyone around them, constantly trying to earn the validation that their parents never gave them. They become people pleasers, obsessed with that external harmony, the hoaki, at the total expense of their own self-respect.
And what's the opposite extreme? The other reaction.
That is the hardened defender. This person internalizes the parent's rigidity. They become extremely defensive, totally unable to apologize themselves.
Why is that?
Because the act of admitting fault triggers the exact painful memory of being that vulnerable, silenced child who was crushed without any recourse. So they'll either deny they did anything wrong, they might gaslight the other person, or they'll offer one of those non-apology apologies that's followed by a debilitating but.
I'm sorry I yelled, but you made me angry.
Exactly. They are terrified of being the victim again, so they must always maintain the position of power. They end up replicating the exact ego defense mechanism that they hated so much in their own parents.
And there's another consequence the sources highlight, which I found fascinating. Emotional illiteracy.
Yes. Since children learn their emotional mapping from adults, the lack of parental apologies, combined with the total lack of open discussions about feelings, leaves the child without a crucial internal emotional map.
We didn't learn the emotional vocabulary, the koninut, because
Yeah.
our parents didn't have it to give us.
Precisely. So they grow up unable to name their own feelings. They might identify stress as just anger or deep sadness as being tired. And when conflict arises, they just don't have the tools to articulate their own experience, which leads to overreacting or freezing or just avoiding the issue entirely.
It's not a lack of intelligence.
Not at all. It's a lack of an internal glossary for their own emotional states.
And this must severely distort their sense of love and relationships. The lack of apology establishes a really skewed logic of what love is supposed to look like in the home.
It does. The sources note that in this model, love gets defined as endurance, dung submission, sacrifice, and silence. And it doesn't require respect or fairness to be present.
So in their adult relationships,
The child is often predisposed to accepting partners who minimize their feelings, who ignore their boundaries, or who are quick to blame. This toxic pattern feels uncomfortably normal to them because it mirrors the core dynamic of love they learned in their formative years. Love without justice, love without validation.
there's also the obsession with being right and the extreme perfectionism that comes out of this. If the authority figure in your life is never wrong, then you grow up with an absolute terror of making mistakes yourself.
It manifests as perfectionism, a crippling fear of failure, and really high levels of self-punishment as an adult. Their highest standards are less about healthy ambition and more about self-defense.
The thinking is, if I don't make a mistake, then no one can scorn me. No one can humiliate me. I won't have to experience that uncorrected childhood pain ever again.
So they're constantly over-delivering, especially at work. Not for joy, but to avoid the deep, gut-wrenching shame of inadequacy.
And finally, the sources describe this persona, the super-endurer, the Xiuqiu Young.
This is the adult who learns very early on that since no one is going to fix injustice for them, they must simply learn to hyper-endure toxic situations. They rationalize staying in miserable places, bad jobs, toxic friendships, unhappy relationships with phrases we all know.
I can handle it. Or, it's a small thing, I shouldn't complain.
Yes. But the source material is very clear. This is not strength. This is emotional numbness and self-abandonment. They accept the unbearable because they were conditioned from a very young age to believe that enduring pain is the price you pay for external stability. They sacrifice their authentic self, their bansuk, just to maintain a semblance of peace.
Okay, so we've identified the wound, we see the destructive behaviors that stem from it. Now, let's make the shift toward action, toward healing. The source material introduces this really powerful concept of the old child, the Ia Kraja. And this is the listener, right? The millennial, the Gen Z adult, who is so capable on the outside, maybe highly educated, but is internally stuck.
Yes, the old child is prematurely aged. They are exceptional at reading other people's moods. They are often, as the sources say, overly good or overly polite. They're highly functional.
But internally?
Internally, they're drained. They often feel like they're disappearing from their own lives, losing their sense of self amidst the constant noise of other people's expectations. Their competence was something that was required for their survival as a child. It was never something that was freely affirmed.
Which is precisely why so many successful old children suffer from this debilitating imposter syndrome.
Exactly. And the sources insist that true healing is not about waiting for your parent to change. It's not about trying to achieve immediate forgiveness. Those are external factors. Healing is about achieving internal freedom.
It's about not letting the wound control your actions, regardless of whether that apology ever arrives.
It's deeply rooted in Stoic wisdom, really. It's about distinguishing between what you can control, your own response, your boundaries, your self-love, and what you cannot control.
Which is the parent's emotional capacity, their reactions, or whether they ever decide to apologize.
We have to stop fighting the battles that belong to their generation and start focusing on our own.
And this requires us to look at the ego again, but this time it's our own ego. The goal isn't to destroy the ego that makes us defensive or makes us a hyper-apologizer. It's to tame it.
It's to understand what our ego is trying to protect. That fear of judgment, of abandonment, of weakness, and then we have to teach it a healthier, less destructive way to protect us.
This leads to the most critical skill that can differentiate our generation from the last one, and that is taking responsibility without engaging in self-punishment.
The Kenang Nantrak Niam Kong Tu Trak Min. This is how we break the cycle. It's how we stop being either defensive or a doormat, and the sources give a really practical 3-step method for training this new skill.
So step 1, name the behavior. You have to focus strictly and entirely on the action, never on your identity. For example, you say, I spoke too harshly in that meeting, or my reaction to that news was disproportionate.
And you never use those absolute shaming terms like, I'm a terrible employee or I'm useless at communicating. That separation is huge.
Which brings us to step 2. Separate ego from mistake. A mistake does not define your identity.
This is the crucial leap the older generation couldn't make, which is why they had to deny the mistake entirely to protect their sense of self. You have to affirm to yourself, I am a good, capable person, but that specific action I took needs an adjustment. This is what prevents the shame spiral that leads straight to defensive denial.
And then, step 3, adjust without self-torture.
You commit to the corrective action, but without the self-flagellation. You view the mistake as data. It's just information for growth. So you think, I will apologize to clarify my intentions and ensure it doesn't happen again, rather than, I have to apologize because I'm a horrible person and need to lose face.
It's a neutral, non-judgmental approach, and it helps us avoid both the defensiveness of our parents and the victimhood of the hyper-apologizer that we might have inherited.
The sources are also really adamant that we have to dedicate real effort to learning emotional language, the Ngon Ngunazug. This was the previous generation's greatest deficiency, and it's still a hurdle for many of us. They only knew the tools of silence or yelling or just ignoring feelings completely.
So our new skill is being able to articulate our emotional state clearly, both to ourselves and to other people. Saying things like, I feel vulnerable because of this uncertainty, or I apologize for reacting so strongly, I was feeling really stressed and overwhelmed.
Using that kind of emotional vocabulary ends the pattern of suppression that we grew up with. It converts that abstract, overwhelming pain into actionable information that people can respond to.
And furthermore, we have to learn the skill our parents systematically lacked, which is setting boundaries of love ranjutum.
Boundaries are not rebellion. They are necessary lines to prevent people from stepping on each other's feelings and to prevent emotional damage from just accumulating over time.
This is often the hardest part for the old child, isn't it? We were trained to believe that love means enduring anything and everything.
It is, but setting a boundary is a profound act of self-respect. It means being able to articulate clearly and calmly, I need 5 minutes to calm down before we continue this conversation, and I'm going to walk away until then. Or saying, I don't want to be spoken to in that tone. I need you to give me a respectful explanation. Boundaries are a sign of emotional maturity, not disrespect.
And if we're going to break this loop for the next generation, we have to be the ones who model what a proper apology actually looks like. The sources detail a 3-step structure that you can use in all your adult relationships.
Okay, so step 1, acknowledge the specific issue. You have to be specific, not I'm sorry for whatever I did. It's I understand why you were upset. The specific way I phrased that comment was wrong.
Then step 2, validate the other person's feeling.
Yes, I know that particular phrase hurt you and it made you feel unheard.
And finally, step 3, commit to correctional action.
I will be more careful to choose my words next time. And critically, no buts, no minimizing, no counter-blaming. This is the definition of an apology that actually restores connection, which is the part our parents were never taught.
The path to healing, though, often involves trying to confront the past. And this brings us to the really difficult, often explosive task of having a dialogue with our parents. The sources warn that talking to them about these old wounds can feel like, entering a gas-filled room. Any little spark can cause an explosion because both sides have so much unhealed pain.
That's why you have to treat these conversations with, military-grade precision. You have to adhere to the rules of engagement, because when you bring up an old issue, the parent's brain immediately defaults to survival mode. They don't hear your pain, they hear you failed as a parent.
Even if you don't say those words.
Even if you don't. So we have to prioritize communication for connection, not for winning some moral victory.
So the first rule of this dialogue is absolutely essential. Choose the softest time.
Never, ever approach them when they're tired or hungry or angry or stressed about money. Their mood determines 70% of the receptivity. The actual words you say are only 30%. You need them in a calm, settled state. Maybe during a light activity or when they're already happy about something small. You have to lower their defenses before you even begin to engage.
Then, rule 2, use I statements. This is probably the most important psychological tactic to prevent them from getting defensive.
It is. So instead of saying, you hurt me when you ignored my feelings, which just triggers their ego defense, you have to rephrase it. You say, that incident made me feel small and vulnerable for a very long time. Or, I remember feeling so sad back then because I didn't understand how to fix it.
Why does that work better?
Because the parent's brain is wired to fight an accusation. But it has a natural primitive tendency to want to soothe expressed pain in its own child. So using I feel statements bypasses that power ego and goes straight for the parental instinct.
And rule 3, affirm their love first. This is the safety net that catches them before the vulnerability of the topic strikes.
You have to start with the line that disarms their protective mechanism. Something like, I know you love me and you always wanted the best for me, even if we didn't always connect on it. This acknowledges their good intent before you touch on the painful result, which prevents them from thinking you're attacking their fundamental value as a parent.
We also have to manage our expectations ruthlessly.
Oh, absolutely. Dialogue is for connection. It's for them to know your pain. It is not for winning an argument, and it is certainly not for forcing an immediate apology. The sources are very realistic about this. An apology may be a mountain too high for them to climb. It would require them to dismantle the very core of their fragile ego.
So the goal should be simpler. They know the impact of their actions, you have spoken your truth, and maybe you can reduce future friction by establishing a new, healthier way of talking to each other.
And this brings us to what is probably the hardest truth for the listener to internalize: accepting the unsaid apology. The words may never come. They may be psychologically and culturally unable to deliver them, and we have to learn how to live without those three words.
Acceptance here doesn't mean saying their actions were okay or minimizing the pain.
Not at all. It is about freeing yourself from that cycle of endless expectation and disappointment. It's freeing yourself from that subconscious feeling of, I have to keep proving I'm worthy until they finally admit I was right all along. The healing doesn't require their confirmation. It requires our own self-confirmation.
So finally, what does all of this mean for the future?
Well, the sources argue that we, the old children, we have the greatest and most profound advantage. Because we know the pain so intimately, we have lived inside the consequence of the silent apology. We know exactly what not to repeat.
We are the first generation that is fully equipped with the knowledge and the emotional vocabulary to actually stop the cycle of toxic transmission. We're the generation who can finally choose to apologize correctly, to listen with genuine respect, to parent without using our ego as a shield.
We can use love and peace rather than fear to guide our homes and our relationships. We don't need some massive revolution. We just need small, daily acts. Practicing softness towards ourselves, setting gentle but firm boundaries, being ruthlessly honest in our communication.
True growth isn't about being stronger than other people.
It's about not transmitting your inherited pain to the next generation. That's the whole ballgame.
So today, we decoded the parent's power ego, that brittle suit of armor built on historical scarcity and fear, and the deep wounds it created in us. Wounds that lead to behaviors like hyper-apologizing, crippling perfectionism, and conflict avoidance.
And the path to healing is found in understanding the systemic roots that bound them, while managing our own responses and focusing on our own internal peace and self-compassion. The previous generation, they reacted to scarcity and fear with a hard shell. We have the right, the emotional literacy, and the knowledge to choose a different path.
A path of softness, of vulnerability, and of honest communication. Remember, your pain is not your fault, but healing is your responsibility. It requires a lot of bravery to stop demanding an apology from the past and start writing a new script for the future.
So the question we want to leave you with is this. Your parents, trapped by their power ego, could not apologize to you. What small, brave apology will you make today, either to yourself for years of self-punishment or to someone else in your life, to finally stop the transmission of this inherited trauma? That's your next deep dive.